the unwavering support of my G7 counterparts on this vital matter. Mr. Speaker, the UK is at the forefront of a new campaign to end the tragic loss of species around the world. We cannot bequeath a planet where the Sumatran tiger and the African elephant and entire ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef live in the shadow of destruction. So I'm delighted that the G7 accepted UK proposals for more ambitious targets to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. Britain is responsible for 2.6 million square miles of ocean, the fifth largest maritime estate in the world. Our Blue Belt programme will ensure that marine protected areas encompass 1.5 million square miles, and at the G7 I announced a further £7 million for this vital effort. I also announced another £10 million to protect the rainforest in Brazil, where 41,000 fires have raged so far this year, more than twice as many in the same period in 2018. Britain is bidding to host the UN's 26th Climate Change Conference next year. If we succeed, we shall focus on solutions that harness the power of nature, including reforestation. And there is one measure that would address all those issues, Mr. Speaker. And if they think that's a waste of money, Mr. Speaker, I think that tells you all you need to know about the modern Labour Party. One measure that will address all those issues, and that is ensuring that every girl in the world receives the education that is her right. That will not only curb infant mortality, eradicate illiteracy and reduce population pressures, it would strike a blow for morality and justice. In Biarritz, the G7 therefore endorsed the UK's campaign for 12 years of quality education for every girl in the world. And I announced new funding for £90 million so that 600,000 children in countries torn by conflict, where girls are twice as likely as boys to be out of the classroom, get the chance to go to school. And as well as my G7 colleagues, I was delighted to meet other leaders, including President Ramaphosa of South Africa, Prime Minister Modi of India, Prime Minister Morrison of Australia, who heroically masked his emotions in the face of the historic innings of Ben Stokes. And in every conversation, I was struck by the enthusiasm of my colleagues to strengthen their relations with this country, whether on trade, security and defence, science and technology. Mr. Speaker, I was also able to use the G7 to follow up my conversations in Berlin and Paris with Chancellor Merkel and President Macron on Brexit, as well as with Prime Minister Conte, Prime Minister Sanchez and President Tusk. I have since spoken to Commission President Juncker and many other leaders, and I was able to make clear to them all that everyone in this government wants a deal. But we do. But it is a reality that the House of Commons have rejected the current withdrawal agreement 3 times, and it simply cannot be resurrected. And that is why I wrote to President Tusk.
Order, Mr. Chairman. I look to you as a senior and distinguished elder statesman in the House to set an example of good behaviour, analogous to the Buddha-like calm of the Father of the House, which is exhibited at all times, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is why I wrote to President Tusk on the 19th of August to set out our arguments why any future agreement must include the abolition of the anti-democratic backstop. We have also been clear, which is, by the way, is opposed on all sides of that. We have also been clear that we will need changes to the political declaration to clarify that our future relationship with the EU will be based on a free trade agreement and giving us full control over our regulations, our trade and our foreign and defence policy. This clarity has brought benefits. Far from jeopardising negotiations, it is making them more straightforward. In the last few weeks, I believe the chances of a deal have risen. This week we are intensifying the pace of meetings in Brussels. Our European friends can see that we want an agreement, and they're beginning to reflect that reality in their response. President Macron said, if, I quote, if, Mr. Speaker, they don't want to hear the words of our counterparts across the Channel. They don't want to hear about any progress that we might be making. They don't. Mr. Speaker.
Order! I want to hear everything said in the order. Well, I've never had any difficulty hearing the Prime Minister, but if it is necessary for him to speak up, I am certain... Order! I'm certain that he'll overcome his natural shyness in order to do so. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think they're willfully closing their ears to the reality that our friends and partners are increasingly seeing the possibilities of an agreement. I quote President Macron of France. If there are things, he said, which as part of what was negotiated by Michel Barnier can be adapted and are in keeping with the two objectives that I've mentioned, stability in Ireland, which we all support, and the integrity of the single market, we should identify them in the coming months. Is that the negative spirit of the opposition benches? No, it isn't. And speaking in Berlin of possible alternatives to the backstop, Chancellor Merkel of Germany said, once we see and say this could be a possible outcome, this could be a possible arrangement. This backstop is a sort of placeholder which is no longer necessary. She said. That's a positive spirit, which we are not, I'm afraid, hearing echoed on the other side of the House today. And I believe there are indeed, they're fleeing already, Mr. Speaker, to go to the big, fleeing already. There are indeed solutions. They don't want to hear about solutions, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to hear about solutions, but they don't want to hear about a deal. There are practical arrangements that we can find which avoid anyone putting infrastructure on the Irish border, Mr. Speaker. And I say to the honourable members departing back, and he knows it well, these have been well worked out and involve measures such as trusted trader schemes, transit provisions, frontier zones, reduced bureaucracy for smaller local traders, and many others. In particular, we recognise, and I advise the members opposite to pay attention to what is being said. We recognise that for reasons of geography and economics, agri-food is increasingly managed on a common basis across the island of Ireland. We are ready to find ways forward that recognise this reality, provided it clearly enjoys the consent of all parties and institutions with an interest. We will also be discussing this with the EU shortly, and I will be discussing it with the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, when I see him in Dublin on Monday. Mr. Speaker, it is simply wrong. It is simply wrong to say we are not making progress. There is a lot to do in the coming days, but things are moving. And a major reason for that is that everyone can see that this government is utterly determined to leave the EU on October the 31st, come what may, without a deal, if necessary. And that is why over the summer my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has been leading the government's efforts 7 days a week to accelerate our national preparations for this possibility. And he will be making a statement on that subject shortly. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has made all the necessary funds available. We have already reached agreements with our partners to roll over trade deals worth around 89 billion of exports and imports. We have secured air services agreements around the world. We have increased the capacity of our border force, strengthened the resilience of our ports, bolstered our freight capacity, and worked with meticulous detail to ensure the uninterrupted supply of critical goods, including medicines. We will be ready, Mr. Speaker. We will be ready. Mr. Speaker, I returned from the G7 with real momentum in the Brexit discussions. I want to return from next month's European Council in a similar way, with a deal that this House can debate and scrutinise and endorse in time for our departure on October the 31st. But, Mr. Speaker, there is one step that would jeopardise all the progress that we have made in the G7 and around the capitals of Europe. And that is if this House were to decide that it was simply impossible for us to leave without a deal, and to make that step illegal, to force us, that's what they want, to undermine our negotiation, to force us, that's what they want, to force us to beg for yet another pointless delay. If that happens, all the progress that we have been making will have been for nothing. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, a deal was published. A bill that the Leader of the Opposition has spent all summer working on. And this is not a bill in any normal sense of the word. It is without precedent in our history. It is a bill that, if passed, would force me to go to Brussels and beg an extension. It would force me to accept the terms offered. It would destroy any chance of negotiation for a new deal. It would destroy it. And indeed, it would enable our friends in Brussels to dictate the terms of the negotiation. That's what it does. There is only one way, Mr. Speaker, to describe this deal. It is Jeremy Corbyn's surrender bill. That's what it is. It means running up the white flag. The bill's shameful. It means running up the white flag. And I want to make clear to everybody in this House, there are no circumstances in which I will ever accept anything like it. I will never surrender the control of our negotiations in the way the Leader of the Opposition is demanding. Mr. Speaker,
Order. People mustn't keep ranting from a sedentary position. However long it takes, the statement will be heard and the response to it will be heard. That is the reality, and nothing can gainsay it. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we promised the people we would get Brexit done. We promised to respect the result of the referendum, and we must do so now. Enough is enough. The country wants this done, and they want the referendum respected. We are negotiating a deal. And though I am confident of getting a deal, we will leave by October the 31st in all circumstances. There will be no further pointless delay. This House has never before voted to force the Prime Minister to surrender such a crucial decision to the discretion of our friends and neighbours overseas. Because what this bill would mean is that unless we agree to the terms of our friends and partners, they would be able to keep us in the EU for as long as they want and on their terms. And I urge, therefore, this House to reject this bill tonight so that we can get the right deal for our country, deliver Brexit and take the whole country forward. And I commend this statement, Mr. Speaker, to the House. Thank you.
Order. For the avoidance of doubt, there is no vote on a bill tonight. There is a vote on a motion. And if that motion is successful, there would be a bill tomorrow. Order. I say this simply because the intelligibility of our proceedings to those observing them is important, and I'm sure everybody on all sides of the House would recognise that fundamental truth. The Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. And I join with him in recognising the great human suffering of World War II, the great human bravery that took place during that war, in that awful conflict which began 80 years ago, but was essential in defeating the disgusting ideology of the Nazis and fascism at that time. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister met EU leaders over the summer and the EU Council President Tusk at the G7. After these meetings, the Prime Minister struck an optimistic note, saying the chances of a deal were, in his words, improving. His optimism was not shared by those who have been at the same meetings. The Prime Minister may claim progress is being made, but EU leaders report that the government has so far failed to present any new proposals. Can the Prime Minister clear this up? Can he tell us if the UK has put forward any new proposal in relation to the backstop? If so, will he publish them so that these proposals can be scrutinised by Parliament and by the public? It's becoming increasingly clear that this reckless government only has one plan: to crash out of the EU without a deal. The reality is exposed today in the in-house journal of the Conservative Party, otherwise known as the Daily Telegraph, which reports the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff calling negotiations a sham. Reports that the strategy is to, quote, run down the clock, and that the proposal to alter the backstop is a complete fantasy. And those are the words of the Attorney General. No deal, Mr. Speaker, will mean food shortages, reduced medical supplies and chaos at our ports. Not me. Not me saying that. The government's own leaked analysis says, and it warns of chaos all across the board. Today, we had expected a publication of the government's no-deal preparations. This government is hiding from scrutiny, hiding from the people, and trying to hide us from their true intentions. This isn't just a government in chaos, but a government of cowardice. Thankfully, some in Whitehall are putting these vital documents into the public domain. But we shouldn't have to rely on sporadic leaks. So will the Prime Minister set out today when these documents will be published so that the people and Parliament can scrutinise and debate them? Many on the benches opposite would relish a no deal. They see it as an opportunity to open up Britain to a one-sided trade deal which puts us at the mercy of Donald Trump and the United States corporations. That will increase the wealth of a few at the expense of the many. When it comes to the crunch, Mr. Speaker, too many on the government benches who once opposed a no-deal outcome are now putting their own careers before the good of the people of this country. Just look at all those Tory leadership candidates who said it would be wrong to suspend Parliament in order to make no deal a reality, more likely, but sit passively as their principles of just a few short weeks ago are cast aside. I don't know what they were doing over their summer holidays, but something changed. And it gets worse. Not only have they all stood by while the Prime Minister launches his latest attack on democracy, some have repeatedly refused to rule out the possibility that the government could ignore any law passed by Parliament which was attempting to stop a no-deal Brexit. So will the Prime Minister, when he responds in a moment, take the opportunity to assure the country that his government will abide by any legislation passed this week by this Parliament? The attack on our democracy in order to force through a disastrous no-deal Brexit is unprecedented, anti-democratic and unconstitutional. Labour will do all we can to protect our industry, protect our democracy, protect our people against this dangerous and reckless government. I condemn the rhetoric the Prime Minister used when he talked about a surrender bill. I hope he will reflect on his use of language. I really do hope he will reflect on his use of language. We're not surrendering because we're at war with Europe. They are surely our partners. If anything, it is a no-deal exit that would mean surrendering our industry, our jobs, surrendering our standards of protections in a trade deal with Donald Trump and the United States. Mr. Speaker, the UK should be using its position in the G7 to promote policies to tackle the climate emergency. The climate emergency is real. But instead of standing up to President Trump to save his blushes this time, it was in fact agreed there would be no joint communique on this at the G7. This is not leadership, this is fiddling while the Amazon burns. The situation across the Amazon should be a wake-up call to this Prime Minister, who once described global warming as primitive fear without foundation. As we watch fires rage, not only across the Amazon, but Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, does he stand by those sentiments? While funds to protect and restore the Amazon rainforest are welcomed, the Prime Minister knows this is merely a drop in the ocean. So will more money be pledged for the Amazon, and are additional funds being made available to tackle fires in sub-Saharan Africa? And will he be introducing measures to stop UK companies from aiding, abetting and profiting from the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and indeed the rainforest in West Africa? The UK Parliament on May the 1st became the first state parliament anywhere in the world to declare a climate emergency, and I was proud to move that motion. We must continue to show global leadership on this issue. On Iran, Mr. Speaker, it's notable that the Prime Minister fails to condemn President Trump's decision to unilaterally tear up the internationally agreed Iran nuclear deal, creating this crisis which now risks a slide into even deeper conflict. Does the Prime Minister plan to work with European partners to restore the Iran nuclear deal and de-escalate tensions in the Gulf? We're clear that in government Labour would work tirelessly through the UN for a negotiated reinstatement of the nuclear deal and to defuse the threat of war in the Gulf. Effective diplomacy, not threats and bluster, must prevail. And will the Prime Minister call on the Iranian authorities to end the unjust detention of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe? And what actions has he taken so far to ensure her release from the terrible situation that she has been plunged into? Mr. Speaker, we're all concerned about the situation in Hong Kong. No government anywhere should get to shut down rights and freedoms or to pick and choose which laws it adheres to. Will he urge the Chinese government to stick to the Joint Declaration of 1984 and stand up for the rights of citizens in Hong Kong? Mr. Speaker, later today, this House has a last chance to stop this government from riding roughshod over constitutional and democratic rights in this country, so that a cabal in Downing Street can crash us out without a deal, without any democratic mandate and against the majority of public opinion. He isn't winning friends in Europe, he's losing friends at home. His is a government with no mandate, no morals, and as of today, no majority.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman knows full well that this country has engaged actively with our European friends and partners, to make sense of the Iran nuclear deal and to ensure that that deal continues. And he will know that the FCO, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, continues to work actively to secure the release not just of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, but all the very sad consular cases that we are currently dealing with in Iran. I pay tribute to him and to the work of all his officials. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad for what he said about the importance of preserving democracy in Hong Kong, and he will observe the strength of the G7 statement on that matter. But quite frankly, when it comes to the bill that he is assisting in bringing forward tomorrow with the procedure that is coming forward tonight, Mr. Speaker, let us be in no doubt. This is a Bennite, a former Bennite opposite. I mean, he still is a Bennite, I believe. He is a man who voted against every single piece of EU legislation. He voted against Maastricht, he voted against Lisbon, time and time again. He has said that we must uphold the result of the EU referendum. Time and time again he has said that he's on the side of democracy and vindicating the will of the people. And what do we see now, Mr. Speaker? He has been converted he has been converted with his hordes of momentum activists trying to take over the streets, converted into the agent of those who would subvert democracy and overturn the will of the people. He has become, that is what he wants to do. He wants to entrust the decision about how long this country remains in the European Union to our friends and partners in Brussels and not to this House. That is not democracy, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid that the right honourable gentleman opposite, inadvertently or not, has become the agent of further delay, further confusion, further uncertainty for business in this country and abroad. That is what he is prescribing. That is what he stands for. That is the result of his policy, and I urge everybody on all sides of the House not to support his approach. Let us go forward and not back with the honourable member opposite.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's extraordinary knockabout performance today merely confirms, it seems to me, his obvious strategy, which is to set conditions which make no deal inevitable, to make sure that as much blame as possible is attached to the EU and to this House for that consequence, and then as quickly as he can fight a flag-waving general election before the consequences of no deal become too obvious to the public. Perhaps my right honourable friend would let me know whether that clear explanation of his policy is one he entirely accepts, and does he also accept that if he gets his way and gets no deal, we then have to begin years of negotiations with the Europeans and the rest of the world about getting new trade, security, other arrangements in force? And does he seriously think that this approach will obtain from any other country in the world a free trade arrangement which is half as good as the common market which Conservative governments have helped put together over the years?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as he knows, I'm a keen fan and a lifelong fan.
I want to hear what the order. Sit down. Sit down. Yeah, I'm very grateful. I want to hear what the Prime Minister has to say in response to the question, and that answer, that response, must be heard. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the Father of the House knows, I'm a long-standing admirer of the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, and indeed I was the only member of the 2001 intake to vote for my Right Honourable friend as a leader of the Conservative Party. I was. A fact that I don't think he much thanked me for it at the time or since. But I've long been a fan of his, and indeed in many ways we are ad item in our views of policy. And I agree with him, Mr. Speaker. I don't want an election. I don't want an election. We don't want an election. I don't think he wants an election, Mr. Speaker. By the way, as far as I can make it out, we don't want an election. We want to get the deal done. And the best way, Mr. Speaker, to get a deal is to support the government in the lobbies tonight.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? My goodness, this is the second time the Prime Minister's been at the dispatch box. This must be the shortest-lived honeymoon in parliamentary history. You simply have to look around the benches. He may say he doesn't want an election. His colleagues certainly don't want one, but I'll let him into a secret. We do. Because we want the people of Scotland to be able to have their say on this shambolic government. The Leader of the House talks about the strategy of the Prime Minister, and I have to say to him respectfully, when we hear use of the word collaborators, when we hear the use of the word surrender, the Prime Minister really should have some dignity and show some respect to the office that he temporarily holds. And of course, I think one of the most remarkable things that took place during the statement was to see the member for Bracknell cross the floor. Prime Minister, you've lost your majority. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend, we saw commemorations across the world to mark the 80th anniversary of the Second World War, when brave citizens came together and stood together against tyranny. My thoughts and those of my party are with those who suffered, the veterans and their families. We should also recognise that the European Union is the legacy of 2 world wars that had ripped Europe apart. The European Union has been an important vehicle for peace and stability in Europe. Turning to the G7 summit, Mr. Speaker, I wish to express my shared concern at the unrest in Hong Kong. I also associate myself with the actions on climate change on protecting the Amazon rainforest. But, Mr. Speaker, I do take issue with President Trump's comments in relation to Russia. It is not acceptable to condone Russia's military and cyber aggression around the world. Furthermore, while the summit declared its support for progress in the UK, the President of the United States failed to challenge Russia's violation of international law in Ukraine, another utterly disgraceful lack of leadership from the President of the United States. Mr. Speaker, following the summit, the Prime Minister displayed his own lack of leadership by moving to prorogue Parliament and strip power away from elected representatives, closing down Parliament by sending 3 Privy Councillors to instruct the Queen to sanction the closure of Parliament. 3 Privy Councillors acting on the instructions of the Prime Minister to shut down Parliament. Where is the democracy in that? And while we can dance around and profess to speak for the people, Mr. Speaker, we all know the truth. He is in fact doing the opposite. By proroguing Parliament, the Prime Minister is robbing the people of power, robbing them over a say over their future. In true Trumpian style, the Prime Minister is acting more like a tin-pot dictator than a Democrat. He talks of the will of the people, but what about the will of the people of Scotland? Prime Minister, the Scottish people did not vote for Brexit. The people of Scotland did not vote for a no-deal Brexit. They did not vote for the Tory party, and they certainly did not vote for this Prime Minister. The people of Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. The Scottish people voted overwhelmingly against the Tory party and this government. The people of Scotland made their choice, and they chose that the SNP should be their voice. So I ask the Prime Minister, are you a Democrat or not? Do you respect the will of the Scottish people or not? And will you, Prime Minister, if you believe yourself not to be the latter, then will you give the people back their say, allow Parliament to have its say, respect the will of Parliament in stopping a no-deal Brexit that would be devastating for jobs and communities?